Hello, a very warm welcome to Middle East Matters. I'm Sanam Shantier. Coming up on this week's show, a century since the Balfour Declaration, a contested document that changed the face of the Middle East. Egypt moves toward criminalizing child marriage, but the tragic tales may continue as parents in rural areas feel no obligation to stop the practice. Plus, we'll be speaking to Amrou Al-Kadhi, an Arab drag queen who's caught between two worlds, the conservative and the colourful. We start with a 67-word document that has changed the face of the Middle East, one that's been celebrated by Israelis and contested by Palestinians and historians alike for decades. But what is the Balfour Declaration? Well, France 24's Shirli Sitbon explains.
Palestine in the early 20th century. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs live in the territory still part of the Ottoman Empire, as well as a minority of Jews, a growing minority, fleeing persecutions mainly in Russia and Poland. Some Jews believe a return to Palestine or Zion to them is the best option for their future. After decades of lobbying, those Zionists convinced the British government to back their initiative. That's the Balfour Declaration, issued by Foreign Secretary Lord Balfour.
Of course it was a founding document because it was maybe the first time that a very prominent politician expressed his solidarity and expressed his support for creating a homeland for the Jewish people in the mandatory Palestine. And it was really the ground rule, or it paved the way to other decisions that eventually materialized in Israel having its independence.
The British government didn't just have the Jews' interests at heart, but mainly its own. Among them, keeping the Suez Canal area under control. The UK also hoped Jews would help it win the First World War through their alleged lobbying skills.
Jews represented some kind of vast international power, and that Jews could persuade President Woodrow Wilson in America to join the war. And Russian Jews could persuade the government of Kerensky to stay in the war.
But the British also promised Arab leaders to create an independent Arab kingdom. To the French, they offered to share the same territory. They also cut deals with the Ottomans so they would stop fighting.
Some of the British were very much bothered by these conflicting promises. On the other hand, put yourself in the shoes of the Prime Minister, David Lloyd George. His country is in a terrible jam, and he was willing, I think, to double-cross just about anybody in order to win the war.
With their conflicting promises, the British eventually worsened animosity between Arabs and Jews. And 1 century on, the Palestinians are demanding an apology.
The question is that we condemn the British colonial power, which they are implanted a foreign body in our land and purchasing our people outside of our country.
For the British, the Balfour Declaration by no means denies the Palestinians' right to statehood. The document calls for the protection of non-Jewish communities. The current government says this means the Palestinians too should have their country, and only then would the declaration be fully applied.
Masoud Barzani, the longtime president of Iraqi Kurdistan, announced over the weekend that he was stepping down amid a fallout from a controversial independence referendum. The vote was a gamble for the one-time guerrilla fighter, and his departure has left the Kurds with no credible successor. Now to Saudi Arabia and a historic announcement. Starting next year, women will be permitted to attend sporting events in stadium. They will, however, be in an area separate from the male-only crowd. This is the Conservative Kingdom's latest step towards easing rules on gender segregation. Now, that announcement comes a month after Saudi Arabia granted women the right to drive. Earlier, I spoke to Fatima Baishan, who is the country's first female spokesperson on this topic, and she explained exactly why the ban on female motorists will be lifted in June.
So with respect to the 10-month run-up, this is really about facilitating implementation. So we're talking about potentially millions of new drivers on the road. So this requires finishing municipal works. This also requires augmenting the police force that's already existing on the ground. This also includes building driving schools, et cetera. So it's more about the institutional capacity build-up with that respect.
You can watch that interview in full on our website, france24.com. Moving on to Egypt, where girls under 18 are continuing today to get married. The country's lawmakers announced in October that they're moving to impose measures against child marriage. But in rural areas where the phenomena is widespread, many families have no intention of changing their practices.
Negla is 15 years old. Although barely beyond childhood, in a few months she will have to leave her family to move in with her husband. In her village, like many in Egypt's rural areas, child marriages are widespread.
It's normal, commonplace, to be engaged at my age. It's the same for all my friends. There are even girls who are married before I was. Some of them even have children, even though they're my age.
When proposals started arriving, I was a bit anxious. I refused. But with this pressure from everyone, I accepted, as people told me she'll end up beyond marrying age and then never get married at all. So I accepted.
According to Egypt's national statistics body, 40% of women under the age of 18 are married. But according to women's rights groups, the real numbers are far greater, as child marriages often go unrecorded. This traditional practice is also linked to economic factors. It allows the flow of funds from a dowry to support a family. Negla's aunts and her mother were all married when they were children.
To support us all, my father had us all married off by 14. That way the boys have more of a place in the house, they sleep more comfortably and they can save more food for them. Everyone behaves this way in the villages because life is hard here. My husband thinks that he's indebted to us if he marries our daughter.
Marriage under the age of 18 has been illegal under Egyptian law since 2008. But sheikhs in rural villages continue to illegally sanction marriage between minors. Sihem Ali is a lawyer in an organisation that works to defend women's rights. She believes there are two solutions to effectively fight against child marriage.
We need a strict law criminalising this practice. But above all, we must raise awareness among families. If society isn't well prepared, people won't accept this law and will continue to dodge it. That's what's happening right now.
There is a need to strengthen the law while explaining to families that these illegal marriages won't guarantee a better future for their daughters. This is a considerable task while the country battles an ongoing economic crisis.
We end this week's show with Amrou Al-Kadhi, who grew up between two cultures. Now, until the age of 11, Amrou was an Iraqi living in the UAE and Bahrain, immersed by religion, Arab morality and an obligation to keep up appearances, a silencing experience for someone with a gender identity disorder, something the 27-year-old came to reject as a teenager. In a bid to renounce Islam and a Middle Eastern heritage, Amrou turned to drag and is now part of a troupe called Denim. Now, interestingly, through performing, Amrou has been able to reconnect to what were once rejected Arab roots. Amrou Al-Kadhi joins us from London. Amrou, what would you say the turning point was for you to go from your so-called forced conservative persona to a razzle-dazzle drag act?
I suppose there were two turning points. The first being at the age of 13, sort of the realization that I was gay, and from everything I had learned in Islam and from what I had seen in Islamic communities, I knew that was going to be a big issue. So I suppose I started preparing for my exile But then when I went to Cambridge at 18, I was the first time I had no parental surveillance or anything like that. And that really allowed an opportunity for me to play with gender and drag in a free way.
And for a part of your life, you actually turned your back on your Middle Eastern roots. As a 13-year-old, you even came out as white, you said. Now, how were you able to rediscover your Arabness?
Yeah, I mean, I was so terrified of what I had learned about punishment and hell for being gay and all those kind of things that I just thought Islam was turning its back on me, so I didn't want to have anything to do with it, and I felt really far away from it. And then in my early 20s, I reconnected with a Muslim fashion editor who really reminded me of all the things that I really loved and missed about my mum and the Middle East and all these things I had pretended I didn't care about. And I think I was still feeling really anxious and hollow. And after she styled me for the Denim music video, which you just played, I started kind of looking at images of my mother and dressing up as her and using drag as a way to fall back in love with the Middle East, because I wanted to celebrate my heritage and not just pretend it had nothing to do with me anymore, I suppose.
You just talked about channeling your mother and even the late Kulthum. And women from the region have been approaching you, seeing you on stage and saying that they feel empowered by this.
What I'm trying to do in my drag, I think, is really celebrate Middle Eastern femininity and the power it has. And Muslim women have come to my show and said they found it so wonderful to see a performer performing Middle Eastern femininity as a strength and something that's really, really powerful and exciting and just in charge of itself. And I think Middle Eastern femininity is so coded as weak.
But of course, we are still talking about a largely conservative society, which is very extremely sensitive about the portrayal of Islam and their heritage. So not all the reactions have been all that positive.
I've had backlash from, many Muslims saying this is really inappropriate, but I've had just as many queer Muslims and more kind of contemporary Muslims saying that they find what I'm doing really, really empowering. And actually, the same really happens in the UK. I mean, it doesn't really feel like a sort of woke utopia here in the UK. Loads of people approach me saying that they're really inspired by what I'm doing, but I also get a lot of racism and kind of just a lot of hate rhetoric from the EDL and lots of death threats. So I think it happens in both. It's not like Muslims are angrier with me than British people are. It's like there's love and hate coming from, because there's so many different kind of variances and interpretations of Islam, and some people think that what I do is really celebratory of Islam, actually showing that Allah can love a queer person.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Amrou Al-Kadhi, thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24. And thank you for watching this edition of Middle East Matters. Don't forget you can follow us and catch up with all our news on Facebook and Twitter.